They thought I'd never learn the truth about the money, about the whispered lies, about the cruelty hidden behind a mask of familial concern. After months, no years of biting my tongue, of watching a nightmare unfold in slow motion, I finally learned the full devastating truth about what happened in my mother's final days. My name is Rebecca. I'm 27 and I'm a painter. My life has always been about capturing emotion on canvas, but no palette could ever prepare me for the colors of grief, betrayal, and ultimately, shocking vindication I've experienced. My most notable achievements, if you can call them that, weren't splashed across gallery walls, but echoed in the quiet, sterile rooms where I held my dying mother's hand, managed her agonizing daily needs, and tried to shield her from a coldness sharper than any winter wind, a coldness emanating from her own flesh and blood. What I didn't know was that my mother, in her infinite wisdom and quiet strength, had already painted her own masterpiece of truth, one that would be unveiled in the most public and dramatic way imaginable. The truth I discovered wasn't just about stolen savings, it was about a stolen dignity, a stolen peace, and the lengths one person would go to for greed, even at the expense of a dying parent. If you've ever felt overlooked, manipulated by family, or watch someone you love be exploited, comment and subscribe. You are not alone. Trust me, if you're someone who believes in justice, who yearns to see the wicked get their due and the good find peace, this story will resonate deep within your soul because it's a story of how the most devastating betrayal led to the most unexpected and profoundly satisfying revelation. Growing up, I was always the other daughter. Margaret, my older sister, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong in our mother Angel's eyes. Mom, bless her heart, had a blind spot the size of Texas when it came to Margaret. Rebecca, was the quiet artistic one, content with my canvases and a smaller circle. I poured my energy into my painting, finding solace in strokes of color and light, a stark contrast to the often gray reality of my family dynamic. I was hardworking, often juggling part-time jobs to fund my art supplies and contribute to my own upkeep, never wanting to be a burden. Margaret, on the other hand, always seemed to glide through life. She married George, a man whose ambition mirrored her own, and together they cultivated an image of effortless success, a nice house in the suburbs, new cars, and a carefully curated social media presence that screamed prosperity. I always felt there was something hollow beneath their polished veneer, but Mom saw only Margaret's supposed achievements. The power dynamic was set in stone long before Mom got sick. Margaret was the favored one, the one whose opinion mattered more, the one whose calls Mom always took, even if she was in the middle of a sentence with me. So when Angel received the devastating diagnosis, a terminal illness that would slowly steal her from us, it was almost a foregone conclusion who would take charge. "Don't worry, Mom," Margaret had declared with an air of practiced solemnity shortly after the diagnosis, when Mom agreed to move into the guest house on Margaret's property. We were all in Mom's small living room, the air thick with unspoken fears. "I'll take care of you. Rebecca can focus on her art. She has enough on her plate. George and I will make sure you have everything you need." She even sketched out a vague care schedule, mentioning how she'd pop in multiple times a day. Mom's eyes, already clouded with worry, filled with a fragile relief. Even I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this crisis would bring out the best in Margaret. It was a foolish hope. The first red flag, though I didn't recognize its full crimson shade at the time, was the swiftness with which Margaret took control of Mom's finances. "It's just easier this way, Mom," she'd said, producing forms for Angel to sign. "I can manage your bills, your pension, make sure everything is handled smoothly so you don't have to stress." Angel, weak and trusting, had signed. Example 1, initial financial takeover. I felt a prickle of unease, a small voice whispering that this was too much, too fast, but I silenced it. Who was I to question Margaret, the capable, successful daughter? The promised care schedule from Margaret quickly evaporated. It was me, Rebecca, who became Mom's primary, almost sole, caregiver. I'd drive over to the guest house daily, often staying from morning till night. I learned to administer medications to help her bathe, to cook meals she could tolerate, to simply sit with her, holding her hand, listening to her fading voice share memories or fears. My painting suffered my own life put on hold, but I didn't begrudge a moment of it. This was my mother, Laura. My best friend since kindergarten was my rock. "It's not right, Beck," she'd say during our infrequent coffee breaks, her brow furrowed with concern. Margaret swans in for 10 minutes, snaps a selfie with Angel, and then posts about #family first while you're doing all the heartbreaking, backbreaking work. And this financial control, it stinks. I knew she was right, but what could I do? Confronting Margaret always ended in her dismissing me as too sensitive or jealous. Any attempt to gently mention Margaret's neglect to Mom was met with, "Oh, Beck's Margaret's just so busy, dear. She has a lot on her plate with George and the house." The excuses were always ready, always accepted. The psychological impact was immense. I was exhausted, emotionally frayed, and increasingly resentful not just of Margaret, but of Mom's inability to see. Mrs. Hathaway, Angel's kind elderly neighbor from her old street, who sometimes visited, saw it though. "You're Margaret and that husband of hers," she'd clucked one afternoon after they'd made a fleeting, condescending appearance at the guest house. "All gloss and no substance. You child are the one with the true heart." Her words were a small balm. My coping mechanism was to pour my frustration into silent sketches in my notebook, dark, angry lines that I'd never show anyone. The first real signs of me trying to fight back were small, pathetic attempts to get Margaret to contribute. "Margaret Mom needs her prescription picked up, and I have to help her with her physio. Could you possibly—" The excuses were always elaborate, always about some pressing engagement George had or a sudden, urgent household matter. The injustice pattern was clear. Margaret reaped the familial rewards while I bore the burdens. Little did I know the stakes were about to be raised far beyond anything I could have imagined, and the final straw was looming heavy and dark on the horizon. The last 6 months of Angel's life were a blur of fading light and increasing pain. Her illness progressed relentlessly, each day stealing a little more of her. My world shrank to the confines of the guest house, a small, sterile space that Margaret had initially touted as a haven, but rarely graced with her presence. My paintings gathered dust in my small studio apartment. My life was a cycle of medication schedules, soft foods, whispered reassurances, and the constant gnawing fear of the inevitable. Margaret and George, however, seemed to exist in a parallel universe of brunches, social engagements, and perceived importance. One particularly grueling afternoon, I was struggling to help Mom eat a few spoonfuls of soup. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the spoon, and her appetite was almost non-existent. I was coaxing her, my back aching, from leaning over my heart, aching from her frailty when the guest house door opened without a knock. It was Margaret and George on one of their brief visits. Event Margaret and George's brief visit. Margaret, dressed in a crisp new outfit, wrinkled her nose slightly. "Beck, it's a bit stuffy in here, isn't it? Have you opened a window?" No offer to help, no gentle word for Mom beyond a cursory, "Hi, Mom, how are you feeling?" George, meanwhile, was idly scrolling through his phone, occasionally grunting in response to something Margaret said. They stayed for perhaps 10 minutes discussing their plans for a weekend getaway, a new restaurant they'd tried, George's latest brilliant business idea. They barely made eye contact with Angel, who watched them with a tired, wistful expression. Then, as quickly as they'd arrived, they were gone. "Urgent matters," Margaret had chirped, air-kissing Mom's cheek from a safe distance. After they left, a single tear traced a path down Angel's sunken cheek. "They're so busy, dear," she whispered, but the sadness in her voice was palpable. My own frustration simmered, a hot knot in my stomach. I wanted to scream, to rail against their monumental selfishness, but I bit my tongue for Mom's sake. That night, I called Laura, my voice cracking. "I can't do this, Laura. I just can't watch them treat her like an inconvenience." "Oh, Beck," Laura sighed, her voice full of empathy. "She's your sister, but she's acting like a monster. You're an angel doing what she should be doing at least half of." I felt trapped, defeated. My love for Mom was a fierce protective fire, but Margaret's indifference was like a constant dousing of icy water. I was burning out, and the person who should have been my partner in this was instead an additional source of pain. The pattern of neglect was not just established, it was a blaring daily torment. A few weeks before, Angel passed a letter arrived from the bank regarding Mom's account. A routine statement. Mom was asleep, her breathing shallow. Out of a habit born from managing her affairs, I opened it. My eyes scanned the figures, then froze. The balance was drastically, impossibly low. Thousands of dollars, almost her entire life savings, were gone. A series of large withdrawals, all recent, all made online. My blood ran cold. Example 2, discovery of theft. My hands shook as I cross-referenced the dates. These weren't for medical bills I'd paid or household expenses. This was something else. Margaret was the only other person with access. I drove to Margaret's main house, my heart pounding a furious rhythm against my ribs. I found her in her pristine kitchen, sipping wine, scrolling through her phone. "Margaret," I began, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. "I just saw Mom's bank statement. Almost all her savings, they're gone." She didn't even look up immediately. "Oh, that. Don't worry your pretty little head about it." "Don't worry." I felt a surge of disbelief. "Margaret, it's tens of thousands of dollars. Where did it go?" She finally met my gaze, her eyes cold, dismissive. "I borrowed it. It's a loan. I needed it for something." "A loan? Did you ask Mom? Does she know?" A flicker of something, annoyance, guilt, crossed her face before she smoothed it over. "Of course she knows. Well, not in detail. She trusts me. Besides," she added, a cruel little smile playing on her lips, "what does she need money for now? Realistically, it's better it's put to good use." Her callousness stole my breath. Good use? Margaret. That was her security. Her everything. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Rebecca," she scoffed. "It's fine. And listen." Her voice hardened. "You are not to upset Mom with this. She doesn't need the stress. Her condition is fragile. If you say anything and it makes her worse, that will be on your conscience. For Mom's sake, just drop it." The emotional blackmail was a punch to the gut. She was using Mom's illness, Mom's love for us, as a shield for her theft. I stumbled out of her house reeling. The stakes had just been raised to an unbearable level. I was no longer just dealing with neglect, but with outright calculated theft, and I was being threatened into silence. That evening, I confided in Laura, the words tumbling out in a torrent of anger and despair. "She stole from her Laura, our dying mother. And she told me not to say anything or I'd make Mom worse." Laura was incandescent with rage on my behalf. "That absolute, Rebecca, this is beyond anything. This is criminal. I know, but what do I do if I tell Mom the shock? Margaret's right, it could be terrible for her." I felt utterly helpless, caught in an impossible bind. A day or two later, George cornered me at the local grocery store. Event George's subtle threat. He approached me by the fruit aisle, a practiced, almost pitying smile on his face. "Rebecca," he said, his voice soft, yet carrying an unmistakable undertone of menace. "I hear there's been a little misunderstanding about some finances. Margaret told me." I stiffened. "There's no misunderstanding, George. There's theft." His smile didn't waver. Now, such harsh words. "Rebecca, I know you and Margaret occasionally have your differences. But remember, family is the most important thing. Sometimes for the greater good, a few small things should be overlooked. Do you understand? Don't make things more complicated, especially with your mother being so ill. We wouldn't want her final days to be filled with unnecessary drama, would we?" His eyes, however, were cold, hard chips of ice. It was a clear, calculated threat confirming his complicity. He was warning me, reinforcing Margaret's emotional blackmail. I walked away feeling smaller and more alone than ever, the weight of their combined cruelty pressing down on me. I knew then that they were in this together, a united front of greed and manipulation. The raw wound of discovering the theft and the subsequent threats was still festering when a few days later I saw Margaret. I had just left the pharmacy, picking up yet another expensive prescription for Mom, my own bank account, dwindling from covering these mounting costs. As I walked down Main Street, I saw her emerging from Chic Boutique, one of the most expensive shops in town, laden with several large glossy shopping bags. Example 3. Flaunting stolen money and public humiliation. My blood boiled. Mom's stolen savings paraded as designer clothes. I couldn't stop myself. I marched right up to her. "Margaret, how dare you?" She looked surprised, then annoyed. George was waiting by their ostentatious SUV, and he strolled over, a smug look on his face. "Rebecca, what on earth is your problem now?" Margaret snapped, clutching her bags possessively. "My problem? You're spending Mom's money on shopping sprees while she's dying, while I'm struggling to pay for her medication." My voice was louder than I intended, attracting a few curious glances from passers-by. "Lower your voice," Margaret hissed, her face flushing. "This is my money. I told you it was a loan, and frankly, your jealousy is unbecoming." "Jealousy?" I choked out. "You stole from our mother." George stepped forward, placing a proprietary hand on Margaret's arm. "Now, Rebecca, that's enough. You're making a scene." Margaret explained the situation. "You're just stressed and overreacting." And again, he added, his voice dropping to that same menacing softness, "Think about Angel. Do you really want to cause her more pain with these baseless accusations? The public humiliation, their brazen denial, their continued use of Mom as a shield. It was too much." I felt a wave of despair wash over me. They were untouchable, shielded by their audacity and my love for Mom. Defeated, I turned and walked away, their dismissive laughter echoing in my ears. The very next day, as if to twist the knife further, came the manipulative flower display and George's taunt. I was at the guest house, painstakingly going through a pile of Mom's medical bills, trying to make sense of them, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety about how they'd all get paid. Mom was dozing fitfully in her chair. The door opened and in swept Margaret, followed by George, who silently placed a couple of grocery bags on the small counter. Margaret, with a flourish, presented Angel with a small, rather sad-looking bouquet of supermarket carnations. "For you, Mom, just to brighten your day," she chirped, as if she'd performed an act of profound generosity. Angel, unaware of the financial carnage, managed a weak smile. "Oh, Margaret dear, that's lovely." I sat there frozen, the injustice a bitter taste in my mouth. George, noticing my strained expression, smirked. "You should learn a thing or two from Margaret Rebecca," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She's always thinking of others." That was it. The absolute unmitigated gall. The hypocrisy. It was the last straw. I slammed the pile of bills down on the table with a loud thud, the sound startling Mom. I need some air." I choked out and fled the guest house, tears stinging my eyes. "So dramatic," I heard Margaret comment mockingly as I rushed out. I collapsed onto a bench in Margaret's manicured garden, far enough from the guest house, and sobbed. This was my lowest point. I was grieving the mother I was losing, battling her illness alongside her, and now I was also contending with the monstrous betrayal by my own sister and her husband, all while being painted as the difficult, jealous one. I felt utterly broken. What I didn't know then was that Angel, despite her weakness, was more perceptive than any of us gave her credit for. She had seen the strain on my face for months. She had noticed Margaret's increasingly superficial visits and my growing despair. And perhaps she had her own suspicions about the finances, a mother's intuition that something was deeply amiss. In those quiet hours when I thought she was merely resting Angel with a strength I couldn't fathom, was preparing her final, powerful rebuttal. She was writing the truth that would soon explode into all our lives. The decision to fight back wasn't mine to make. It was already being orchestrated by the very person we were all, in our different, twisted ways, trying to protect or exploit. The call came on a Tuesday morning. I'd been with Mom until 3 a.m., finally coaxing her into a fitful sleep. Exhausted, I'd gone back to my tiny apartment for a couple of hours of rest, setting an alarm for 6 a.m. to be back before she woke. Laura had insisted I take a short break, go to an early yoga class she'd booked for me just 2 hours to clear my head. "She'll be okay for that short time, Beck. You need it." I'd reluctantly agreed. My phone rang at 7:05 a.m. just as I was rolling up my yoga mat. It was Margaret. "She's gone," Margaret said, her voice flat, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Mom passed away about half an hour ago." A pause then, with an unmistakable edge of accusation. "I don't know where you were, but you should have been here." The words hit me like a physical blow. Guilt, sharp and immediate, swamped the nascent grief. I wasn't there. For her very last moments, I wasn't there. Margaret's cold, calculated cruelty twisted the knife. It was my absolute lowest point, a confluence of sorrow and a profound manufactured guilt that threatened to drown me. The days leading up to the funeral were a nightmare. Margaret naturally took charge of all arrangements, her efficiency a stark contrast to her previous neglect. The morning of the funeral, she called me not to offer comfort, but with instructions. Event Margaret directs outfit and lies about care for Mom. Rebecca makes sure you wear something suitably somber but elegant. Black, of course. And please try not to look too devastated. We need to project strength. People might think you're weak or looking for pity if you overdo it. I was speechless. Her concern was purely for appearances. At the church before the service, I overheard Margaret talking to some distant relatives, her voice dripping with false sorrow. "It's been so exhausting." She sighed, dabbing at a dry eye. "Staying up so many nights caring for her, George and I barely slept. But you do what you have to do for your mother, don't you?" The lies were so blatant, so audacious, my stomach churned. Several attendees influenced by Margaret's carefully crafted narrative of the devoted daughter, and perhaps perceiving my genuine raw grief as overdoing it, offered me polite but cool condolences, their eyes holding a hint of judgment. I sat in the pew, Laura's hand gripping mine tightly, feeling the weight of their silent censure, a fresh layer of pain on top of my grief and guilt. Whispers followed me, no doubt, fueled by Margaret. Rebecca was hardly ever there at the end, or Margaret bore the brunt of it all. The service began somber and traditional. Eulogies were read, tears were shed. I felt numb, adrift in a sea of sorrow and injustice. Then, as the service was drawing to a close, the priest Father Michael cleared his throat. "Before we proceed to the committal, Tim," he announced, his voice steady and calm, "Angel entrusted me with something, a letter. She asked me very specifically to read it here today to all of you." A ripple of surprise went through the congregation. My head snapped up. A letter from Mom. My heart began to pound. This was the turning point. The atmosphere in the church shifted instantly from somber remembrance to tense anticipation. Margaret, sitting in the front pew with George, looked momentarily confused. Then a flicker of unease crossed her face. Father Michael unfolded a piece of paper. "This is in Angel's own hand," he said, holding it up briefly. Then he began to read. "My dearest friend's family and my beloved daughters." Mom's voice, though read by the priest, seemed to fill the church. "If you are hearing this, then my time on this earth has ended, and I pray at peace. There are some things I need to say, things my heart could not bear to voice while I was still with you for fear of causing more pain than I could manage in my final days." The church was utterly silent. I held my breath, a wild, improbable hope blooming in my chest. "To my daughter Rebecca," the priest continued, his voice resonating with emotion. "My sweet, selfless Beck, you have been my rock, my comfort, my unwavering angel of mercy through these last difficult months. You bathed me, fed me, held my hand through the darkest nights, sacrificed your time, your art, your very life to care for me. You did this with love, with patience, when I know your heart was breaking. There are no words to express my gratitude and my profound love for you. You saw my suffering and you eased it without complaint, without fanfare. God bless you for being such a wonderful child. I know you discovered certain discrepancies regarding my finances. I know you chose silence to protect me from further distress. Thank you, my darling, for that impossible kindness. You are good through and through." Tears streamed down my face, but these were not just tears of grief. They were tears of validation of a heavy burden suddenly miraculously lifted. I felt Laura squeeze my hand, her own eyes shining. Across the aisle, I saw Mrs. Hathaway nod slowly, a look of profound understanding on her face. Then Father Michael's tone shifted subtly as he read the next part. "To my daughter, Margaret." I saw Margaret stiffen. George put a hand on her arm, but she shrugged it off. "Margaret," the letter continued, Angel's words now carrying a weight of sorrowful judgment. "We need to talk about the money, my money. The savings I had carefully put aside over a lifetime money I had earmarked for my grandchildren, for Rebecca's future, for my final expenses. You know what I'm talking about, Margaret. You drained my bank account. You took it all without my explicit permission for your own uses while your sister struggled to pay for my medicines." A collective gasp swept through the church. Every head turned towards Margaret. Her face, moments before composed in a mask of dignified grief, was now a shocking canvas of scarlet and white. "This is outrageous!" Margaret suddenly cried out, jumping to her feet. "This is slander. Mom was confused. She didn't know what she was writing. Rebecca put her up to this. George was by her side trying to pull her down. Margaret, please. No!" She shrieked, her voice high and shrill, shattering the sacred silence. "She was always jealous of me. Always. Rebecca poisoned Mom against me." Father Michael held up a hand, his expression firm, his voice cutting through her tirade. "Mrs. Bennet, please. This is Angel's letter. Her final words. We will hear them with respect." He looked directly at Margaret, his gaze unwavering, and there was no mistaking the authority in his voice. The power dynamic in the room had utterly, irrevocably reversed. Margaret seemed to shrink under his gaze, her outburst deflating into ragged breaths. The eyes of every single person in that church, friends, family, neighbors, people whose judgment she had so carefully cultivated, were now fixed on her no longer with sympathy, but with dawning horror and contempt. The whispers started again, but this time they weren't about me. Father Michael continued reading Angel's letter. "You told yourself it was a loan, perhaps. You told yourself I wouldn't need it. But it wasn't yours to take Margaret. It was a betrayal, not just of my trust, but of the sacrifices I made for you throughout your life. While you paraded an image of success, you were robbing your dying mother. While Rebecca tended to my every need, you were tending to your own greed." The letter went on to detail her disappointment in Margaret's neglect, her superficial visits, the pain of feeling like a burden to her successful daughter. It wasn't angry, not truly. It was profoundly, devastatingly sad. It acknowledged Margaret's marriage and house, but pointed out that true richness comes from character, not possessions. When Father Michael finished reading, a heavy silence descended, broken only by Margaret's choked sobs, which now sounded less like grief and more like the desperate gasps of a drowning woman. George, his face pale and grim, tried to lead her out, but she seemed rooted to the spot, exposed and shamed before the entire congregation. The shock on the faces of the funeral attendees was palpable. People who had earlier offered me cool condolences now looked at me with open sympathy, some with tears in their own eyes. My moment of triumph wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. It was about my mother's final brave act to protect me, to validate me, to ensure that the narrative Margaret had so carefully constructed would crumble to dust. Angel, even in death, had given me back my peace, my name. Margaret finally broke. With a strangled cry, she pushed George away and fled down the aisle, her elegant black dress a stark contrast to her utter humiliation. George, after a moment of stunned hesitation, hurried after her, his own carefully maintained composure shattered. The heavy church doors slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing the finality of their public disgrace. The immediate consequences had begun swift and brutal. I sat there, tears still flowing, but a profound sense of peace. A peace I hadn't thought possible began to settle over me. My mother's love, her truth, had set me free. The immediate aftermath of the funeral was like emerging from a storm into a strangely altered landscape. As people filed out of the church, the atmosphere was thick with stunned silence, then hushed, urgent whispers. Margaret and George had vanished, their departure as dramatic and undignified as Angel's letter had been powerful and composed. No one spoke of it directly to me at first, but the looks I received were no longer cool or judgmental. They were filled with a mixture of pity, respect, and a dawning understanding. Laura stayed glued to my side, a protective lioness. "I knew your mom was amazing, Beck." She whispered her arm around my shoulders as we stood outside the church, the chilly air a welcome contrast to the emotional furnace within. "But that was epic. She gave you the greatest gift." In the first 48 hours, the town was buzzing. Our hometown wasn't large. News, especially scandalous news involving one of its prominent families, traveled like wildfire. Margaret's attempts at damage control, as I later heard, were frantic and futile. She apparently called a few key family members and mutual acquaintances, trying to spin the letter as the ramblings of a senile woman or worse, a fabrication orchestrated by me. But Angel's reputation for clear-mindedness, coupled with Father Michael's unshakable affirmation of the letter's authenticity and her specific instructions, made Margaret's denials sound hollow and desperate. Mrs. Hathaway, who had witnessed Margaret and George's snobbery and my quiet dedication firsthand, was particularly vocal in her defense of Angel's words and my character. My response to the unfolding drama was to withdraw, to finally allow myself to grieve for my mother without the suffocating weight of Margaret's manipulations. I spent those first days in the quiet of my small apartment, surrounded by my canvases, Laura checking in, constantly bringing food, just sitting with me in comfortable silence. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. I felt raw, exposed, but also profoundly, deeply validated. The truth was out. Angel had made sure of it. A few days after the funeral, I received a phone call. It was Aunt Carol Mom's younger sister, a relative who had been noticeably cool towards me at the church, clearly swayed by Margaret's earlier campaign of lies. Event after the funeral. After the letter was read, a call from a relative who previously believed Margaret's words. "Rebecca, dear," she began, her voice hesitant, tinged with remorse. "It's Carol. I just wanted to call and say, I am so deeply sorry." Aunt Carol. I was surprised. "Yes, dear. After what Father Michael read, Angel's letter." I was shocked. Utterly shocked. I realize now I misjudged you terribly. Margaret had painted such a different picture, and I believed her. Hearing Angel's own words about your care, about everything, it made me ashamed. You've carried such a burden, and with such grace. Your mother was so proud of you, and rightly so. Her apology was genuine, heartfelt. It was another small piece of healing. Other relatives and acquaintances reached out too, some in person, some via messages. The community reaction was largely one of disgust towards Margaret and George, and immense sympathy for me and for Angel's ordeal. The illusion of wealth that Margaret and George had so carefully cultivated began to crack visibly. Whispers about their debts, their over-leveraged lifestyle, which had always been there beneath the surface, now gained new traction. Angel's money, it seemed, had been propping up more than just their image. There were no official investigations launched, as Angel's letter, while damning, was a personal testament, not a legal deposition. She hadn't wanted a legal battle. She had wanted the truth revealed, and her wish had been granted. The consequences for Margaret and George were playing out in the court of public opinion, which in a small town can be a sentence in itself. I began to establish new boundaries. When a well-meaning but gossipy neighbor tried to press me for more details about Margaret's downfall, I politely but firmly stated, "My mother's letter spoke for itself. My focus now is on honoring her memory and finding my own peace." My newfound confidence was quiet but unshakable. The support system around me, led by Laura, was incredible. They didn't push, they didn't pry, they simply offered their presence, their love, and their unwavering belief in me. The story of Angel's letter became a local legend, almost overnight. It wasn't just about the financial betrayal, it was about a mother's fierce love, a quiet daughter's strength, and the public unmasking of hypocrisy. I knew Margaret and George would attempt to rebuild their shattered image, perhaps by moving away or trying to brazen it out. But the truth, once unleashed with such devastating clarity, has a way of sticking. Angel had ensured that. I felt a sense of resolute calm. The worst was over. Now the slow process of healing and of reclaiming my life could begin. 18 months. That's how long it had been since Angel's funeral, since her letter had detonated in the quiet church, rearranging the pieces of our family and community. The sharp edges of grief had softened, replaced by a tender ache of remembrance and a quiet, steady peace. I was painting again, truly painting. My little studio, once a refuge for frustration, was now a space of creation and light. My work had changed. There was a depth to it now, an understanding of sorrow and resilience that resonated with people. I'd had a small, successful local exhibition, and one of my pieces, a portrait of Angel infused with a gentle, knowing light, had been bought by a collector who said it spoke to her soul. It was a full-circle moment, art imitating life, or perhaps life finally allowing art to flourish. My new life was simpler, quieter, but infinitely richer. I had moved into a slightly larger apartment with a beautiful north-facing window for my studio. I taught a weekly art class for seniors at the community center, finding joy in helping others unlock their creativity. My relationship with Laura was stronger than ever. She was my chosen family. I often visited Angel's grave, not with overwhelming sadness, but with a sense of gratitude for her strength, her love, her final powerful act of truth. And Margaret and George Karma, as they say, has a way of delivering. Their carefully constructed world had crumbled. The public humiliation at the funeral was just the beginning. Long-term karma. Their social standing in our hometown evaporated. Invitations dried up. Old friends became distant acquaintances. George's business ventures, already shaky and likely propped up by Angel's stolen money, faltered and then failed. They had to sell their nice house, the one Margaret had lorded over everyone, to cover their mounting debts. I heard through the grapevine because our town still whispered that they were renting a small, unremarkable place on the outskirts of town, a far cry from their previous displays of affluence. Margaret, stripped of her mother's money and her social pedestal, was reportedly a shadow of her former self. The arrogance was gone, replaced, some said, by a bitter resentment. She'd lost the respect of the community, and more profoundly, she'd lost any claim to her mother's legacy, except as a cautionary tale. There was no grand confrontation, no further public drama. Their downfall was a slow, quiet erosion, the inevitable consequence of their own actions. What goes around truly does come around. They got exactly what they deserved, the ashes of their deceit. The dynamics in our extended family had shifted too. Aunt Carol and I had developed a warm, genuine relationship. Other relatives who had once favored Margaret now saw the truth of her character and the quiet strength in mine. The letter had not just exposed Margaret, it had recalibrated the family's moral compass. One afternoon, while tending to the small rose bush I'd planted by Angel's headstone, Mrs. Hathaway approached me. She was frailer now, but her eyes were still sharp. "Your mother would be so proud of you, Rebecca," she said, patting my hand. "You're living well. That's the best tribute. And them," she nodded vaguely in the direction of town. "Well, they built their house on sand, didn't they?" Her words resonated. My personal growth had been immense. I was no longer the timid, overlooked daughter. I had found my voice not in anger, but in quiet authenticity. I learned that true strength isn't about projecting an image, but about living with integrity, even when it's hard. The experience had been harrowing, but it had forged me into someone stronger, more compassionate and more appreciative of the genuine connections in my life. My victory wasn't about Margaret's ruin, though there was a grim satisfaction in seeing justice served. My victory was in my own healing, in reclaiming my narrative, in living a life that honored my mother's true spirit, a spirit of love, resilience, and quiet dignity. Angel's letter had been her final gift, and it kept on giving, allowing me to finally step out of the shadows and into my own light. I was at peace, a profound, settled peace that I knew deep in my soul was exactly what my mother had wanted for me. The clearest moral of my story is that truth, no matter how deeply buried or fiercely denied, has a powerful way of surfacing, especially when fueled by a mother's love. And integrity, quiet and unassuming, will always outshine the most elaborate facade of deceit. Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone's true colors were dramatically revealed? I'd love to hear about it. If you believe in standing up for yourself even when it feels impossible, like this story. If you've ever been underestimated or manipulated, comment your hometown and share a piece of your own experience. Let's build a community where no one feels alone in their fight for justice. Subscribe for more stories of truth prevailing and justice served. Share this if you want to inspire others to trust their instincts, and know that even in the darkest times, vindication can come from the most unexpected places. Tag someone who needs to hear that their quiet strength is seen and valued. Remember, your voice matters, your experiences are valid, and sometimes the most powerful statements are made not with a shout, but with the undeniable weight of truth. Be brave, be true, and never underestimate the enduring power of a good heart.